serve. As I like to say, it's part of our DNA. So getting to know everyone in our community and being able to help support this wonderful organization is something that we take pride in. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I just need to check quickly that everything's going okay tech-wise over here, and then I'll begin. All right, great, thank you. I'm standing in front of the sign here. Where we go. But basically, so welcome. I have a presentation today focused on people in our community who are living in deep poverty. We're looking at it from a high level, so we'll look at the statistics around it for places like the U.S. Census Bureau and other places. And then we're going to look at it at a granular level. We conducted a number of interviews with POTS clients who live in deep poverty to talk to them about the choices that they make and and how they handle earnings, employment, income, expenditures, and how do they make their lives work on a daily basis. Okay, so just to start with a definition, because I'll be talking about it a lot, deep poverty for our purposes means a household living at or below 50% of the federal poverty level. And this is something that's much more common than you might expect. I have a graph here that shows some information on what percentage of our population lives in this category. In New York State, it's about 7% of the population. In the city of New York, it's closer to 9%. In the Bronx, you'll see it's 13%, and then in our very local community, it's a little bit higher at 14%. But if you take that percentage, that 13%, and apply it to the Bronx, that's 190,000 people who live in our neighborhood community who are living at half or below of the federal poverty level, which is an extraordinarily large number of people. If you look at New York City as a whole, it's close to 800,000 people. So this is a population that is extremely common, but one that maybe we don't think about all that often. For comparison, the homeless population in New York City living in shelters is about 70,000 people, which represents less than 1% of the population. So what is the number? What does it mean to be at or below 50% of the federal poverty level? So you can see here that for a single person, it's about $17 a day of income. And for a family of three, which I'll be referring to a lot because it's the average family size we have here in our POTS community, it's about $28 a day. So for reference, the average apartment rent for the Bronx is $1,100 a month, which works out to be about $37 a day, which you can see from the get-go exceeds even this basic daily number that people have to live on. If you're renting a room, it's closer to $28 a day. The thrifty meal plan is about $15 for a family of three, or $6 for an individual. And if you were to buy a monthly Metro card and divide it over the course of a month, it's about $4 a day. So as you can see, these numbers don't really add up. People are going to have to figure out how to make choices around what are they going to choose between these basic necessities. And as many of you probably know, it can be a struggle to live in New York City, even if you're living at well above the federal poverty line. You have to make a lot of choices, even in those circumstances. So thinking about how those choices would be compounded if you're living at a much lower level is something that we wanted to learn more about. Additionally, we wanted to know a little bit more about what type of resources can help make a life change for people in this group. And in order to understand that better, we talk to people about the choices they make and the challenges that they face. So looking at the POTS service population, I took a look at income, and there's a couple of numbers here. It can be a little bit confusing. The second one, the $12,200, ties back to the way poverty level is calculated. It includes the types of income that are included in the poverty level. So that includes earned income, unemployment insurance benefits, Social Security disability income, public assistance, cash benefits, and earned income. are all included in that number, as is child support. And for the POTS population, we do come in, on average, to be ever so slightly higher than 50% of the poverty level for a family of 3. And looking deeper, we can see that approximately 40% of our population is living at or below 50% of the federal poverty line, which is, shows that POTS really has a large representative sample of this community. One of the reasons people do come to POTS is because they're in a very deeply difficult situation. Often people won't seek help until their situation is very, very difficult. So we do often see people at the troughs of their income. So we'll see people who are coming in because they've lost a job, because they've had a life change, because they're experiencing an eviction. And maybe they'll go back out and not come to POTS for periods of time when things are going well. So it is true that when we see people, when we learn about them, they are in their more difficult spots. Many people who come to POTS do access non-cash benefits, things like SNAP, Medicaid subsidized housing. You can see that as a population that increases their income by about $3,000 a year, which is helpful, but still well below the federal poverty line for a family of 3. So another characteristic of deep poverty is that it is fairly persistent. I think there can be a tendency to think about life as this trajectory. You go to high school, you go to college, you get a job, things get better and better, or maybe you don't have a high school, you only have a high school degree, but you get a job, and then you get another job, and you can advance. There's this positive idea of the trajectory, whereas that's not necessarily the reality for a lot of people, especially people who are experiencing deep poverty. So if you look at people who slip below the poverty line in general, so a very high percentage of American households will fall below the poverty line at some point. This is true because of people having children, or because you lose your job for a period of time, or perhaps you're pursuing education. There are a lot of reasons why you might slip below the poverty line. But about 30% of the people who go below the poverty line at some point remain that way for the next 5 out of 10 years. You may come out after 2 years, go back in, dip. It can be a very uneven process. But it is well known that people who experience deep poverty tend to be on the more persistent side of this poverty. So this has a lot to do with the fact that the circumstances around deep poverty tend to be more diverse and complex, and people who are deeply poor tend to have a much smaller amount of work history, perhaps working only about 25% of the year. So referring to some other focus groups that we had done with POTS's homeless population, actually in 2016 we were trying to see how life circumstance had changed since the financial crisis in 2008, so we'd asked about the previous 8 years of that time. And one thing to note is that about this data shows this persistence. So if you look, there are about 6 people who say that 8 years prior to being homeless, they either were homeless or they were unstable and feared it, and so had that instability. So that shows those families had that persistence, and that's about 30% of that population. The same is true on what best describes the last 8 years. Many people reported that things are either the same or that they've gotten better, again showing that there is a certain percentage, about 30%, where that persistence does exist over a period of time. And a lot of the reason for this is because there are many interconnected challenges that can be very hard to unwind. And so people have ex-offender status, drug addiction, physical disability, mental health disability. They could be raising young children, have a low education, have no family or community safety net, and it's not just having one of these challenges, it's having the combination of these challenges that can make it such a hard thing to change. And then additionally, most government anti-poverty programs are in fact not designed for people who are deeply poor. Most of them are designed for people who either are currently working through the Earned Income Tax Credit Program, which is the largest anti-poverty program of the government, or they're set up in such a way that they assume that there's a future of consistent employment that people can move into. And so they're not designed for specifically this population. Many foundations will shy away from funding work with this population because the outcomes are very hard to show. It's a difficult problem to solve, and if you're working with, say, a preschool-age child, there are other types of interventions that maybe have a higher return on investment for the purposes of foundations. Though, generally speaking, from a direct service model, wraparound services and intergenerational services, so services that work with both the young and the old throughout the family member, are considered a best practice model for this group. And government benefits are essential for ensuring that this population has the resources that they need. And I'll show a little bit about that in a few slides. So just going back to how far 50% poverty is from self-sufficiency, I used the WCECA, it's quite a mouthful. Self-Sufficiency Project has put together in New York City how much does it take to be self-sufficient based on people's needs around food, childcare, housing, health insurance, the whole range of needs that people have to spend money on. And you can see that 50% poverty puts you at about $5,000 a month off what self-sufficiency would be. If you make the self-sufficiency number annualized, they come out to be $72,000 a year, which is much higher than the income of a lot of people. So basically you can see that there is a big gap between the self-sufficiency and the poverty. Here I've added a number of government supports, and you can see that it really does close portions of the gap. So this includes a full suite of SNAP benefits, child care services, and Medicaid, an evaluation for Medicaid. I have not included housing subsidies in this just because they are fairly rare. As I mentioned, 10% of our population has housing subsidies, and there's really not an easy pathway to getting them going forward. But if you were to add in housing subsidies, it would close that gap further. So I think I've presented that obviously it's not a lot of money, and so how do people get by? And that was something that we were really interested in. So we did interviews with a number of clients, and the idea was to understand income, expenditure, and cycles of work to get a better idea of what choices people make, what happens to them, and how they get by. First, just taking a look at the snapshot of employment and earnings. 7 of the 18 people I spoke to are currently employed. And of the entire population, 2 were employed for the entire 5 years, and there were 3 that were not employed at any time during the entire 5 years. So looking at the population, people do work. Work is something that people are pursuing. They're always trying to find a way to do so, but it can be something that's exceedingly hard to maintain. And it's, in many cases, the jobs that people had were both below minimum wage and off the books. And so were fairly unstable types of input. I tried to show some graphs here of the patterns of employment that people reported to me. So when I spoke with people, I asked them about what their work history was like, where there were gaps in work history. Not everybody had a perfect answer for me, but definitely I had enough information from a couple of people to look at when people were and when people were not employed. And you can see what I'm talking about here, where there are periods where people work, they're fairly short, they're fairly low wage, and they can't make up for the periods when they're not working in terms of savings. It just doesn't work that way. There's a lot of short-term gaps. And I think one thing to add to this, I will discuss some of the challenges that they face towards having consistent work that are personal, but there's also been a general change around the enforcement of employment law, around the use of contract employees, around the power of certain types of organizations that have reduced the stability of work for a lot of people that can exacerbate this situation. but going back to people's barriers to work, I have some examples here of different types of barriers that people reported. When I spoke to people, most were working earning between $9 and $12 an hour as home health aides, child care workers, food service employees, day laborers, and store clerks. And the income they were earning was incredibly important because, especially within families, with the instability of work, if one family member is working, they're supporting everybody else who isn't. And then maybe they may lose their job and somebody else comes in. So serving as each other, safety net is extremely important. That being said, there were a lot of reasons why people were unable to, and it either regards having a disabled child and not having appropriate care, or perhaps being undocumented. There were some people who had unmarketable skills. So there are quite a number of barriers that people experienced that made it challenging to hold down a job. We talked a little bit about income as earnings, but in this case, many people also receive public benefit supports. That's an important part of their income. Medicaid is the most common. Everybody who was not undocumented had access to Medicaid. It's nearly universal in the community that we serve, and it's a very common benefit that does ensure providing access to health care for many in our community. SNAP is the second most commonly accessed benefit, followed by Social Security disability insurance. Some people did have housing subsidies. Fewer people had access to cash assistance, and a smaller percentage had WIC, and that's partly because you have to have a child between the ages of 0 and 4 to have WIC. So many of the people I interviewed just didn't have that situation. So another source of income is a social services nonprofit. So for example, if you can come here to eat lunch or access food pantry, that's money that you're not spending, and it's a way of supplementing your income. A number of clients we spoke to used social services nonprofits to expand their monthly income, though many were reluctant to come unless they deemed their situation to be especially dire. There were a few people who served as caregivers for their families who would use a network of nonprofits in order to access services. So for example, there was one client who lived with her sister. She didn't pay for rent unless she had home health aide work, which was inconsistent. But she also took it upon herself to go several times a month to various food pantries around the city to make sure that she was providing food for the household by accessing those services. So I spoke about income, talking a little bit about expenses. So in many cases, people don't spend any money on rent, and they do that by being homeless. That is one answer to how do you make things happen on such a low amount of money. So some were street homeless, some were living in a shelter, and there were a few people who were classified as homeless by living rent-free in family apartments, doubling up in apartments with others. There were, as mentioned, a few people who had subsidized housing. Those people, on average, paid about $55 per month per renter, which is much closer to something that they have the ability to maintain. And then finally, there were another group that lived in market rental apartments, but were either living in a very overcrowded style situation, so many people living in a small apartment, or in the cases that they weren't, many people were very close to eviction. They were either in housing court or would be soon because they were not making rent payments. One thing to add is that NYCHA housing is generally not available in the community we serve. It's a very low density of NYCHA housing in this neighborhood. And the poverty characteristics of the neighborhood are similar to those communities, most notably in the South Bronx, that have more access to public housing. But at the same time, this adds an extra burden on people who live in this community because they have less access to subsidized housing. Medicaid ensures that clients pay close to nothing for health care, and they would report that they wouldn't have any unexpected health expenses. So that is another way that clients are able to get by having the ability to access Medicaid can provides a really important support for this community. I will note that even though access to health insurance is nearly universal, access to good health is in fact not, and in many cases it added extra burdens on families trying to get by. And so I have a list here of various examples that were provided to me by the clients, but basically there are many situations in which either the client's own health care or health needs of others in their household prevented them from being able to seek very consistent work. It's not a representative sample, but this is designed to show how the expense breakdown that people spend on a monthly basis varies in someone in this population of the deep poverty population versus somebody who's living at the self-sufficiency standard. And it's important to note the high percentage that's spent on food, rent and utilities, and transport as compared to other needs in people's lives. So people are prioritizing those basic needs because they have to, leaving sort of any other expenses that might be necessary completely off the table. I did ask how people might cover an emergency expense, and in general, people said that they would ask a family member. Those who said they had no one to ask and that they just would not pay the expense were generally the most vulnerable in this population, and many of those, meaning that they were mostly homeless. So if there is no family safety net in New York City, often that does mean that homelessness will happen. So just to note again that many of the clients I spoke to had multiple challenges that were very diverse. People living in deep poverty are an extremely diverse population of both different types of needs, but also different types of demographics. And it does necessitate a more complex, multidimensional response. It's hard to classify the group as any one thing. It really is the multiple needs that are relevant. So from POTS perspective, we think the multidimensional approach is vital. So our theory of change is that people need access to support in the areas of financial, health, education, housing, and day-to-day services in order to be able to make any sort of change in life. If you get help in financial, but your health isn't assisted, then you're still likely to be pulled back into the challenges that you originally faced. So it is our opinion that it is important to address all of those areas. And as such, we provide services across the range of benefits. So access to public benefits, employment assistance, food distribution, for financial, legal support for eviction prevention, for housing, applications and advocacy, a shower, male haircut program, day-to-day needs, health, around Medicaid access. We have a clinic on site that people have access to primary care physician and connections to mental health and substance abuse treatment. And twice a week we have a Narcotics Anonymous meeting here on site. And for education, we're mostly able to provide referrals, but we've also started adding ESL programs on site for periods. So we choose a multidimensional service approach. There are other approaches to meeting this challenge. One is sort of the think tank approach, so doing policy demonstrations, development and advocacy for specific purposes. Another approach is to engage and empower those who are poor to advocate for themselves. And finally, educating the public and building movements around changes to policy and the social contract are all different approaches that people have taken to working on this challenge. And we're lucky today to have some people on our panel who have taken some of these other approaches, who we can talk to about some of these other ways of addressing the challenge. And so I'd like to introduce Helen Strom of the Urban Justice Center Safety Net Project, Josef Aguilar of POTS, and Lea James, an organizer with the Northwest Bronx Community Clergy Coalition, who will be coming up here and joining our panel. We'll have the opportunity for questions after I go through a series of questions to the panel, you can address the whole panel that will open up to the floor. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming and participating today. Do you each want to just provide a quick introduction for yourselves and your background? You want to start, Lea? You can start.
Good morning. My name is Lea James. I'm a lead organizer on equitable economic development at Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition. I've been an organizer for 19 years in different neighborhoods across the city, on a union level as a union organizer and also a community organizer. Northwest Bronx has been around for 43 years, doing health justice, youth justice, challenging all these redevelopment projects in the city, and helping commercial tenants from being displaced. What else do? We do a lot. Oh, yes, and one of the biggest projects that's about to happening in the North Bronx is the redevelopment of the Kingsbridge Armory project.
Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Helen Strom. I'm the Benefits Unit Supervisor at the Safety Net Project at the Urban Justice Center. And our organization provides a bunch of different advocacy and services. So we do legal clinics in food pantries and soup kitchens in different parts of New York City and assist individuals who are facing eviction, who are having trouble accessing food stamps as well as welfare or public assistance benefits. We also more recently have started putting a lot of energy into community organizing and media advocacy work, to work with the community to push for policies, to push to change the narrative about what's really going on and produce change that will actually be meaningful for people who are underserved and marginalized in the city.
Hi, my name is Josef Aguilar. I am the Programs and Single Stop Manager here at POTS. I manage some of the many different programs we have here, employment, case management, and a slew of other things. My background, I'm from California. I moved to New York about 10 years ago. I started working in the private sector. I was managing a psychiatric office, and then life happened. I lost my job. I was unemployed for a little bit, and then I got a temp job working for Food Bank, and as a navigator. So I helped people enroll in health insurance. They placed me here at POTS, and POTS gave me an opportunity. They hired me as a NOAA coordinator, which I did a lot of outreach for SNAP and the services that we provide here, and then they promoted me a little bit at a time. So now I supervise the team here.
Great. So, what do you think are some effective strategies for serving the population that I spoke about in the presentation, and what do you see as challenging? And if you can speak to any specific examples, I'm going to open this up to all of you. Some of the other questions I'll direct, just for time purposes, to one or the other of you, but can you speak with any specific examples?
Well, at Northwest Bronx, all those campaigns that we work on, we also are big on housing justice. So with all the statistics that you showed everyone, we look at the root cause of that. Root cause of health disparities, root cause of unemployment. And we partner with Urban Justice Center a lot to push legislation and policies, especially here in the Bronx. And the big thing of these health disparities is that in the environment that there's no jobs. This area has the highest of unemployment in the Fordham and Kingsbridge area. So what we try to do is on our housing front, we look at these landlords that are potentially trying to sell their buildings. Or actually, we have a program called Landlord Ambassador, where these landlords are actually losing their buildings. People just come to buy it up. So what we try to do is preserve affordable housing, work with the landlord, and then put them in a financing program with HPD. But aside from that, the homelessness that you expressed is that these buildings are in bad condition. So for about 30 years, Northwest Bronx has a weatherization program where we go in, we make the whole building energy efficient, we give you the fixed boiler, we give thermostats, we do your roof, we give you new windows to, sustain the building. So people can live, because these buildings are actually making these people sick. But also pushing the city that if you want to build a building, or you want to change the Metro North system, or you want to do all those things, you have to have a local hiring component. And it can't be 20%, 10%, it needs to be 51%. And that was the push for the Armory. All this stuff can't be if there's no jobs. And as you see, if you're walking through the neighborhood, there are so many buildings being built. Not only are they being built, but they're also non-union. So, and the developer saying, I don't have to do local hiring, I can do what I want. So challenging the city and the state to put in their agreements that they have to do a high percentage of local hiring. Because if there's jobs, none of this won't exist. And then looking on the health side of partnering with like Montefiore and St. Barnabas to create a local hiring component with them. The Bronx here in this area has the highest in asthma. So how can we use large institutions to partner with local groups and say we need to create an initiative? So we have a program real quick called Healthy Buildings, where we know these buildings are making folks sick and they're in jobs. So we can't separate housing and economic development. We have to combine it. So what we do is that we know the buildings are rotten. We go and see who has asthma, hire local Bronx residents to survey their own tenants. And then we clean out the pests and train Bronx residents at hostels to get certified by the state. And they do the work and clean out the pests in their own community. So keeping that shared wealth in the Bronx, because everything is being outsourced. So it's like looking at the redevelopments and the showing that the homelessness. So, that's one tactic that we do, and it's all aligned with each other with the help of our participants.
Great. I mean, I definitely would echo a lot of what you said. And I think probably the biggest challenge that we see consistently when we're meeting with people is just the problem of affordable housing, and housing that is truly affordable, not the so-called affordable housing that's being developed that might in reality be affordable to someone who's making $70,000 or $80,000 or $90,000 a year. Where's the housing that's affordable to somebody who has an income of $10,000 a year, $20,000 a year, someone living in deep poverty, as you're talking about? So that's consistently the biggest issue that people come to us with. Unfortunately, we don't see nearly enough that's available to truly meet this need. Some of the programs that we think are out there that have been effective for some people are Section 8, which allow people to pay 30% of their income, but unfortunately there aren't more Section 8 vouchers that are readily available to the community at this point. I think New York City housing is, another huge resource for the city, although we know there's a lot of problems with New York City housing. However, it is a source of housing where, again, people are able to pay 30% of their income no matter what their income is. And I think some of the things that we are trying to really push from a policy perspective and an organizing perspective is, what is the city doing, what is the state doing to create and preserve housing that's actually affordable for people who are making $10,000, $15,000, $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 a year, because we don't see enough of that happening.
Yeah, the point that I can make in terms of challenges that I see here at POTS, it's of course 100% of what they said. Also, it's a lack of information, or there's a lot of resources out there apart from housing for education, health, employment, and things like that. And one of the challenges is that people don't necessarily see that. We table, we do outreach, and we do a lot to help with that. But I think that also misinformation in terms of immigration rights and immigrant rights and things like that. That's one of the things that I see.
So I'm going to direct this question towards Joseph because of your role that you've done over the years in helping people access benefits. How does the government support help those who are deeply poor, and what changes could be made to improve this assistance?
Not cutting food stamps, that's one. I know that there's been a lot of talk about potentially lowering the amounts. Also, obviously those policies are going to have a great impact. And let me see.
Just basically how we help people through accessing government assistance and how those programs
Well, we help here a lot in terms of every client that we see here, we screen them for benefits, and we tell them you qualify for public assistance. We now just started piloting the public assistance applications. So we are seeing what the issues are between HRA and the clients accessing those benefits. I know that when you go to the center, they put you on a computer sometimes and they say, well, just do it yourself kind of thing. And here at POTS, we're trying to help those clients through that process and working with HRA and the center directly. I know that HRA has a lot of internal problems that they should work on.
So Helen, I know that you've been doing some media work around engaging some public attention to these issues. What do you think some of the best ways to engage the attention of the general public is, and what strategies have you used at this time?
Sure. So a couple months ago, our program launched a project called Stories of Resilience, and that was a project featuring videos. If you want to watch them, it's storiesofresilience.org, where people shared their own experiences dealing with the public benefit system, dealing with public assistance, dealing with food stamps, and the circumstances in their life that led them there, and what they saw as the changes needed and the improvements needed to change the system. And I think stories are very important. I think people latch on to stories, and there aren't a lot of stories being told in the media or in our public discussion about what's really going on. I think very few people in the general public hear much about poverty, hear much about public benefits, really understand what's going on with food stamps, what's going on with public assistance, what's going on with disability. I think it's an area that isn't talked about much at all, which is, I think, shocking and awful because it's a huge issue in our communities. So I think trying to get those stories out there and make sure that we're trying to change the narrative, because we're sort of up against these myths that exist in society, the myth of the welfare queen, right? These ideas of people scamming the system that have been put out there by a lot of people for a long time. So that's what we're up against. I think we need to take back the narrative because we know that those things aren't true. Yet that's a lot of times what we're hearing from certain people in politics and certain politicians, and show what's really going on, and take back the narrative and have a movement talking about these issues so we can create an environment where we can actually get real change.
So, as you mentioned, there's not a lot of discussion about this. Discussing poverty is kind of a third rail in political debates today, and change is not that easy. So, there are groups that have succeeded over time to change the way the general public thinks about an issue. And I'm wondering how we can work with the deeply poor population and as agencies to create that kind of change in conversation. And Lea, I was going to direct this towards you.
So right now, what we're about to do is actually, I'm glad that you brought out this data because I'm going to use it. to actually, so as you see in all of our boroughs, there's a need in each borough, right? And there's an urgency in each borough. So right now in this catchment area in the Bronx, what we about to do right now is start an investigate in the city in workforce ones. Me personally, I've been through public assistance, cash assistance, food stamps, seen it, right? Been through it, with a child and without. But after you go to a back to work program, you go to workforce one. And then you try to get a job. And you might get a temp job or the home care services and things like that. But the city doesn't have data to show that it's being useful. People are having careers. So we're about to investigate the city right now and say, give us a report on how that shows. Now, we also, we need to partner, I want to partner more with POTS because we need to start tunneling and create a pipeline from the folks here and then say they need employment. Hey, we got this project that's about to happen. We need the cap, the percentage to fill it in, and they right here. Even though we go to schools and different things in our clergy, but there's a workforce pipeline, and so that's what I'm envisioning of partnering. Councilman Richie Torres, the governor, we had a meeting with them, Mayor de Blasio, and putting out that the Bronx need urgency. There's funding for programs, no shade to the South Bronx, but it always goes to the South Bronx. It doesn't come up to this area. So with this data and advocating, it said programs like POTS need more funding and more contracts to tunnel people through a workforce so they can be able to sustain themselves. We also deal with NYCHA residents because all these projects have a zip code and NYCHA's involved in it, but they don't have no clue that they could be a part of the project. And people come through our office and I always refer them to POTS, and NYCHA residents like, I don't even know this even exists. So like being more advocating more in the streets and saying, hey, there's an institution there that could support you, and how can we all work together to make sure that happens. So I think advocating on a state and city level to keep programs around like this for the economic side.